Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. This is a virtual panel promoting public safety and fiscal responsibility through juvenile deflection. I am Lisa Pettis, a senior fellow with the Criminal Justice and Civil Liberties Department at the R Street Institute. R Street is a nonpartisan think tank promoting free markets and limited effective government. Prior to my role with R Street, I previously served as a prosecutor, a city councilor, and as an executive director for a victim services organization. Today, I will be moderating the discussion with our panelists. First, some housekeeping. We will be doing a question and answer with our panelists for the first 45 to 50 minutes, followed by questions from attendees. We have a lot of information to get through, so I may at times need to cut off panelists to make sure we hit all of our questions and have ample time for attendee questions at the end. If you do have a question while we're going through the first part of the panel, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A box, and I'll read those at the end to the panelists. If you're having problems with hearing a panelist or myself, please feel free to just put that in the chat so that we know that there's an issue going on. For the panelists today, we have invited individuals with a variety of backgrounds so that we could answer questions from different perspectives. So let me introduce you to our panelists. We have State Attorney Melissa Nelson. Melissa Nelson took the State Attorney for Florida's 4th Judicial Circuit in January 2017. There she leads 300 plus attorneys, staff, and investigators in their pursuit of justice. In 1997, Ms. Nelson started her career as an assistant state attorney and for the next 12 years prosecuted cases ranging from misdemeanors to capital homicides. From 2009 to 2016, she worked as at the international law firm of McGuire Woods. Since taking office, Nelson has implemented many smart justice initiatives and spearheaded modern criminal justice reforms. She established Florida's first conviction integrity review unit, developed a driver's license restoration program, convened the Juvenile Justice Advisory Committee aimed at reducing juvenile recidivism, and engaged the office in an academic research and study focused on making data-driven decisions. Ms. Nelson sits on various boards, both nationally and locally, including ATF's National Crime Gun Intelligence Governing Board, Florida's Cold Case Advisory Commission, the Florida Supreme Court Steering Committee on Problem-Solving Courts, the Council on Criminal Justice, Florida's Criminal Punishment Code Task Force, and Jacksonville's Sulzbacher Center. She's also a fellow of the American College of Trial Lawyers. Next panelist is Ms. Cara Evans-Patterson. Cara Evans-Patterson is the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department's Youth Diversion Program Manager. She has been instrumental in creating effective ways to lower the juvenile arrest rate, minimize school-to-prison pipeline, and reduce racial and ethnic disparities in Mecklenburg County. She joined CMPD in 2012 as a program manager to implement diversion into Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools and the CMPD patrol divisions. That later included surrounding municipalities, which have allowed over 5,000 youth the opportunity to have their cases diverted in lieu of court involvement. Previously, she served in various capacities with Florida's Alachua County's Sheriff's Office as the Teen Court Coordinator, member of the Black on Black Crime Task Force, and member of Alachua County's Children's Alliance. Our next panelist is Jack Charlier. Jack Charlier is Executive Director of Task Center for Health and Justice, also known as CHJ. CHJ is the National Research and Technical Assistance Center for Law Enforcement Deflection and First Responder Diversion for the Comprehensive Opioid, Stimulant, and Substance Abuse Program under the Department of Justice. He's also the Executive Director and co-founder of the Police Treatment and Community Collaborative, also known as PTAC. PTAC is an alliance of 58 national and international organizations and is the global voice of the field of deflection. Jack has authored several articles and publications on deflection, including the seminal 2015 Police Chief article, Want to Reduce Drugs in Your Community? You Might Want to Deflect Instead of Arrest, which first introduced the concept of deflection into the justice lexicon. He's a master global trainer in alternatives to incarceration with the U.S. Department of State, Bureau of International Narcotics, and Law Enforcement. Previously, Jack served in the Illinois State Parole Division and was promoted through the ranks to Deputy Chief. He created the division's first domestic violence units, human trafficking response teams, and the first women's gender-specific trained officers. He is a U.S. military veteran and a member of the American Legion and the Military Officers Association of America. And our last panelist is Jaquita Monroe. Ms. Monroe joined the Annie E. Casey Foundation in 2017 as a senior associate with the Juvenile Justice Strategy Group. She leads work on expanding diversion from the juvenile justice system and collaborates on reducing youth detention and incarceration. Before joining Casey, Ms. Monroe worked in state government in Connecticut. For the judicial branch, she was responsible for education policies for students and the juvenile justice system. Earlier, she was a mental health and investigative child welfare worker for the state's child welfare agency. In the nonprofit sector, Ms. Monroe wrote education, curriculum, and policies for community centers after school and summer school programs, and advocated for families in an alternative charter high school. So 4 very accomplished panelists that we have today. Thank you all first for joining us. I do want to just define for our attendees what we're defining deflection for purposes of our discussion today. Deflection has many different definitions if you look it up on the internet. Some people may not be exactly knowledgeable about the word deflection yet, but for the purposes of our policy study where we review juvenile deflection nationwide, and which this panel has come from, we've defined deflection as a police-led type of pre-arrest diversion. It can include juvenile citations, as well as formal juvenile pre-arrest diversion to case management, youth peer court, or restorative justice. To get a more practical idea of juvenile deflection, I'd like to turn to our panelists. First, State Attorney Nelson, if you could tell us about the program that runs in the 4th Judicial District of Florida. And if you're still on mute.
Thanks. So when I took office 6 years ago, for reasons that are unimportant, juvenile civil citation had been kind of a hot flashpoint, political flashpoint here in our jurisdiction. And our office, that was the prosecuting office, was really a hindrance to law enforcement's utilization of more broad citation. So when I took office, I convened all of the stakeholders that work in the juvenile justice system and brought in all of our law enforcement partners to really define what juvenile civil citation was going to look like in our circuit. Through a series of meetings, we expanded the eligibility criteria, allowing police officers to give citations for a larger number of offenses. And we invested in law enforcement, full discretion and autonomy in making a decision to grant civil citation rather than acting as a blockade. We really saw ourselves as a support, because as you mentioned, it's supposed to be pre-arrest. We did a couple things that I think were successful in putting our memorandum of understanding together in this program. I mentioned we gave law enforcement discretion and autonomy. We created a feedback loop, 2 feedback loops. One, when a youth was in fact arrested, rather than being granted a citation, and that arrest came to our office for a charging decision. If our prosecutor saw that citation was an alternative, we would directly communicate with the officer. That was more prevalent back at the beginning of launching this, because there was an education component, making sure that patrol officers knew this was a tool available to them. The other feedback loop that we developed was once a kid who was granted a citation was actually successful with his or her sanctions, we made sure that the law enforcement officer who issued the citation was notified of that success and was actually given a thank you note from the youth who was given the citation. I think those 2 things in combination really quickly lent to the success. We went from an issuance rate for eligible youth that hovered around 40 to 50%. We're now at 79% issuance rate for eligible youth. And we have 3 counties in our circuit.
And State Attorney Nelson, can you just confirm then, so when juveniles get their citation, that means they avoid the rest completely and are immediately going to case management, or what does that look like?
Yes, so we have a spectrum of potential sanctions. Some can be a neighborhood accountability board that functions really in the space of restorative justice. So, for example, a young person who might steal a bike from a neighbor, the citation is then sent to an administrator who decides sanction. And so that child might be sent to a neighborhood accountability review board. And that's made up of volunteers who sit on that board and then actually listen to the case and render the sanction. That youth may be sent to something we call teen court here, where they have to participate in a program where teens are judge, jury, prosecutor, and defense attorney. The youth may be granted specific sanctions from the administrator, letter of apology, community service hours, et cetera, and or a restorative justice session. So the administrator has a spectrum of options available to her, depending on geographically where the offense occurred. I mentioned we have 3 counties and what programs are available in each of those counties. And so she then issues, the citation is issued obviously by the law enforcement officer. Our administrator decides what the sanction will be. And then she also is the gatekeeper of our data, letting us know what our recidivism looks like, what our success rate looks like, what our taxpayer savings is. So I think the centralization of that has also been key to the success of the program here.
Great, thank you. And Ms. Evans-Patterson, can you tell us about the deflection program for juveniles in Charlotte-Mecklenburg County?
Yes, would love to. Definitely follow Melissa. I started out in Florida with teen court with the civil citation program. So I'm very familiar with the way that, it's done down there. And when we came to Charlotte, my husband and I, this opportunity opened up for CMPD to create a diversion program. Some of the differences are that I get referrals directly from the officer, where diversion is a first-time offender program. So youth between the ages of 10 to 17, when they commit a first-time offense, lower level, they can get referred directly to the diversion program. The great thing about this program is because I work in law enforcement, I have access to those cases immediately, where if it were to go to the court systems, it would take maybe a month or 2 in order for that family to get contacted, where I can contact them within 1 to 2 days. That's one of the benefits. We make sure that we provide education, guidance, and direction through 8 hours of life skills classes. And law enforcement does not teach those. We actually contract with facilitators in community programs to teach those classes. And those classes are based on the type of charges that we have. Most of the charges that we have that come into the program are stealing, fighting, smoking, and drinking. And we provide an assessment to the young people who enter the program and place them in those appropriate classes based on the needs taken from that assessment. We've been in existence coming up on 10 years. We've had about 5,800 referrals come through. 90% of the students do not reoffend, and normally 80% agree to the diversion, and another 80% they complete the program successfully. The program, I think, is amazing. We also notify the officer when they've completed the program, just so they're aware of where the student is. On top of completing 8 hours of life skills, they're also interacting with the law enforcement 14 weeks after they've completed the life skills class, just so they can have one-on-one conversations with the officers, more of an officer-friendly, get to know them, feel comfortable communicating and having a dialogue with officers in the school systems. And we did an MOU as well too, to ensure that the surrounding agencies could also participate. And it's kind of a guideline. We have this thing called graduated response levels, where we feel when an incident occurs in the schools should definitely handle it first. Then we can do our law enforcement diversion. And then if that one doesn't work, the last call is juvenile on arrest. So,
thank you. And I'm gonna take that 90% of keeping juveniles from being rearrested and go into our next question, which is, what are the benefits of juvenile deflection and why is it important? And Ms. Monroe, if you want to start us off.
Yes, thank you. So here at the Casey Foundation, back in 2018, when we started looking at transforming probation, we knew that in order to do that work, we had to significantly drive down how many young people were coming into the system. And we knew that one of the best ways to do that was to have young people diverted, and divert it as soon as possible. And so What we understand from the research that's out there is that when young people get diverted, we know that they're less likely to have negative impact from going deeper and deeper into court involvement, which I think we've heard from both of the previous presenters. They're less likely to reoffend. We know that some of the behavior that they're exhibiting, they're going to grow out of it. And so we want them to be able to grow. We don't want to disrupt kind of like their, that process of growth and development by intervening with court interactions that may not be necessary. And we know also that there are places where they can receive support that don't necessarily have to come from the court. So not only do we want to be diverting young people as soon as possible at interaction, right? We want to be diverting at police contact when possible, but many different opportunities. So if we miss one, we want to have other opportunities to get young people diverted. And we want ideally for them to be diverted to community-based programs where they can build connections with their community, where we can foster family relations, and we can have them have an opportunity to be accountable for any misbehavior that may have occurred. So we just know that why it's important is because it's beneficial for young people, and it also gives an opportunity for them to be accountable to victims who have been harmed, that they may not receive that same level of accountability through a traditional court process.
Thank you. And Mr. Charlier, the guy who helped coin the term deflection, what would you say is the benefit of deflection and why it's important?
Sure. And first of all, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. And what a great panel. I mean, I'm just soaking in everything that the other panelists have said. So rock and roll on that. I'm going to come at it from a slightly more technical answer to that question. I'm going to do it because when we talk about deflection, obviously more than just a new word, it has to do something that people can see, that the taxpayers can see is beneficial. So one of the things, and this doesn't mean it applies to everybody, is we know that the majority of adults actually who have substance use disorder, in other words, they meet a criteria for having a clinical drug use, that started when they were teen or young adults. In other words, we look to our early years of life to set patterns for what happens to us later in life. And so that's one element of it on the substance use disorder side of why youth deflection matters, and getting people access to services at an earlier age to stem stuff from happening before it gets more severe or continues. We also know, for example, that youth with substance use disorder, I'm using that term generally, that can go into young adults at times. They also experience then higher rates of physical illness, mental illness, and lower quality of health throughout their lifetime, not only addiction, but for mental health. So there's kind of a clinical reason that we want to get to people earlier and to get to our youth, obviously, which means early from that standpoint. Another reason to do youth deflection is we know from a pure kind of criminal justice side, right? So when we talk about deflection, we talk about recovery, well-being, families. We do also talk though about crime reduction, and in the world of crime reduction and the factors that we know are based on research, 4+ decades of research now, we know that, for example, onset of delinquency prior to 16 years is a greater likelihood then that that's going to continue on. Drug use starting at prior to 14 years, greater likelihood that's going to go on. And the younger you are, generally, that you begin to engage in things like violent activities, antisocial people, places, and things, the more likely that is to continue deeper. So we want to be with our youth to change that trajectory. And that's what deflection does. It sets a new trajectory that does not involve the justice system being in play. And I think somebody already mentioned even that exposure to the justice system can present challenges. And then finally, we want to talk about equity and the implications of that. And for all youth, by the way, there is a big challenge to being in the justice system. And so deflection and diversion both matter for youth. I want to say that very clearly. It's not one over the other. You do both. But also in this area, deflection matters, as it matters more with substance use, matters more in kind of criminogenic, the risk factors related to future criminality. but it also matters because we know the research has shown us that Black youth are more likely not only to be arrested than their white counterparts, but also not have access to, I'll use the term deflection, but the research is really more around diversion. So prosecutorial and court stuff and beyond diversion opportunities. So deflection sets up a new space that's earlier, that's upstream, that can also then address equity without waiting for diversion, which comes afterwards, right? You've been arrested, you're in the system, and the inequities that occur there. So I'll stop there, but 3 very specific points about substance use disorder, what's called criminogenic risk need, which is crime reduction that we all care about, and then addressing equity and its application of deflection and diversion to get better outcomes for all populations, and really especially looking to make sure Black youth are treated equally, have equal access to the same initiatives at the same rates, and have the same resources available to them.
Thank you for that. And it's great hearing just how strong the research is for these programs. And I think there are certainly agencies out there that already know that research and are excited about these ideas, but implementing can be a new challenge. So I'd love to hear first from State Attorney Nelson just about who should be involved in implementation, who should be involved in the continued management of the juvenile deflection program, and how do you keep communication between all the key players for these programs to work?
Okay. We learned a few things about communication, and I'll end with that, but I'll speak first about who should participate. It's unusual. I don't know how many prosecutors or representatives of prosecuting offices we have in the audience, but I would say it's unusual that our office actually led this effort, because true deflection, pre-arrest deflection, is led by law enforcement, not the prosecutor's office. I think it was important in our circumstance to be the convener of this discussion and of the stakeholders, because we had been previously, our office had been so oppositional to this effort by law enforcement. But I do think it's not to say that a prosecutor's office can't do it in another jurisdiction. I think it's great if they do, but it is unusual, because this really is, to your point, it's a law enforcement led initiative. So when we sent our invitations for our meeting, we had the court system represented, we had our State Department of Juvenile Justice representatives, we had our nonprofit service providers, we had every law enforcement agency in our 3 counties that make arrests and would have the ability to, in lieu of that, offer citations. We had our school board police represented, and our school system, our Duval County Public School System, Nassau County and Clay County Public School Systems. When we circulated, we took the lead on drafting the agreement and what it would look like. We circulated that agreement and allowed revisions and allowed all the stakeholders to give feedback. And that took a few months. And then we convened everybody for basically a celebration, a signing ceremony. We decided to sign our MOU every year. I have changed my thinking on that. I think now we reconvene every 3 years. But we have, teen court is the administrator of juvenile civil citation, and that administrator takes the lead in now communicating the data points I mentioned earlier. We take the lead, that is the prosecuting office, in communicating where we see instances where citation would have been a viable alternative, but instead a youth was arrested. And so we try to keep the lines of communication open with our law enforcement partners, and that's really through the use of email, and with our administrator of the program. And that's generally our juvenile division and that administrator. And then I'll end with this. So who should be involved in the implementation and continued management for our office? It's the director of our juvenile division. She is our point person for our office as it relates to juvenile civil citation.
Thank you. Ms. Evans-Patterson, what are your thoughts about implementation, ongoing management, and the communication between key players?
Yeah, and far as implementation goes, there's a lot of people that need to kind of be aware and kind of have buy-in with it. Definitely our DA's office, our police department, our surrounding police department agencies, definitely the school system, the school police as well too. All those are major partners, just like Melissa mentioned earlier as well. And as far as management goes, normally the law enforcement agencies that houses the diversion program. We report out, monthly report, we do monitoring reports, we track data and all that kind of information as well too. And we can share all that data with the different agencies, the DA's office, the chief court counselors as well too. So definitely having buy-in and having that MOU so they can understand that this is the process that everyone's going to agree on that is beneficial. Like I mentioned earlier, our graduate response levels, everyone pretty much has buy-in and they're saying, yes, the school system should handle it first, followed by law enforcement, and then the court system. So by us having that agreement, we're all understanding that. In the state of North Carolina, there's normally 42% of school arrests that go into the juvenile justice system. But I think because Mecklenburg County has adopted the graduate response level, we're only having about 17% of those involved in the schools entering the juvenile justice system. So again, that MOU is important, and having buy-in from all those agencies is very helpful.
Thank you. And Ms. Monroe, what are your thoughts about implementation and communication between key players?
Yes, so thank you. Really, what we've been doing at Casey is we've been thinking through who are the people that we need to invite in. We've often worked at the system level, and as we go more upstream, as Mr. Charlier spoke about earlier in talking about deflection, we've had to shift in who are the folks that we're going to be working with, who are the folks that we want to build strategy for or help get buy-in to doing this work. And what we understand that to be is that we've got to be able to get buy-in from law enforcement, and we've got to learn how to effectively communicate with community-based organizations where young people would be going. Because as you ask law enforcement to use their discretion to deflect or divert young people, pre-arrest, they've got to know, where are we sending the young people? Where are they going to get the help that they need? And we firmly believe that that help exists in communities with grassroots neighborhood-based organizations that are often doing really good work, don't often maybe call it diversionary work, but they are doing the work to keep young people in the community, at home, and from really getting in trouble again. And that's what we want to see happening. And so really our work has been around, how do we start to begin to work with law enforcement? We've started building some consultative sessions with law enforcement, having a meeting up between law enforcement and young people who missed diversion opportunities, and how that impacted their life tremendously, and not in the ways that you want them to be impacted, right? That they stayed in the system longer, they went deeper into the system, and that those often those young people, which was stated earlier, are Black kids who probably should have gotten a diversionary opportunity, and it just didn't happen for them. And so that's really what we've been building. We're starting to have those conversations. To be honest, it's a new space for us. We have often, like I said, we've been at county level, state level, and sometimes law enforcement has been included in that, in our reform efforts, but not really gone to a place where we say, okay, we need to bring law enforcement in. We need to figure out what's the training that's going to be effective. How do we work with law enforcement? Where do we look for examples? And we've been looking at LA County as they look to divert pre-arrest up to 80% of their young people. We have another kind of site that we're looking at in Baltimore as they look to divert out of West Baltimore young people from the system pre-arrest, working with their law enforcement partners. And so we're looking around the country to see examples. And then we're also looking to help build tools and get the information out to move this work.
Thank you. And you actually gave a great piece to go into our next question. And I'm going to have you, Mr. Charlier, answer it first. So if you have any comments on this current question, please include those in this next question as well, which is criminal justice reform seems to become kind of this divisive word, that just the term alone, reform, can be off-putting to law enforcement at times. And so how do you convince individuals with reform concerns that juvenile deflection is important and is needed? How do you get that buy-in that you all talked about? And like I said, Mr. Charlier, if you would start, and please feel free to also include any information about that implementation and communication process as well.
That sounds good. Thank you. And again, just listening to everything that's being said, loving it. Great job from the other panelists. Yeah, let me just tag on very quickly to the end of that last question. We do technical assistance where we put these sites in play, these deflection sites. And one of the things on the last question that comes up when you're in the deflection realm versus the diversion realm, and we do work in the court space too, so there is a difference. In the deflection realm, you're very much looking much more towards your community partners than you are to your justice partners. Justice partners matter, but we call it setting the table, and you're constantly asking who from the community is not here. And then the other two parts of it is the centering of deflection is community, the centering of diversion is justice. So if you center your responses and your approaches in community, naturally you begin to think of people with lived experience. In other words, the youth themselves who are brought in to understand, kind of like a business brings customers in to understand how their processes work, how they're viewed, things like that. And then finally, the citizenry itself matters greatly in deflection, because unlike diversion, which is run by courts and prosecutors, and that's important stuff, deflection really is sitting in a community where everybody can see it, and so they have opinions and thoughts. Anyway, quickly getting that in there. As to buy-in, the way I respond to this, and again, because we put these sites in, one, contextually, where are we working? What is going on in that community for which they have decided to do deflection. So we might hit kind of the crime reduction space real hard, and that's both on youth and adult. We might hit the well-being, we might hit families intact, whatever the messaging needs to be. I'm not being crass when I say that. Everything exists within context. If you don't know context, you're missing the point. So generically, it's what is going on in a community that has caused them to want to begin to do deflection, and then you have messaging that lines up with that. I will say then, in the broad brush, because we are talking about youth, we do bring up, and it sounds like a cliche, but it's not, is that if we as a community, and we're in a community, or we as a nation, as a people, are not able to put our faith in the future of our citizenry, which is the youth. By definition, we were all there once. At least I was there once. I won't comment on anybody else, panelist or attendee. If we can't put our energy and our resources and our sense of what is coming next into them, we really do have a challenge. So from a very practical level to a very idealistic standpoint, youth deflection is where it's at. It's where you get your crime reduction. It's where you get your future workforce. If you're in the business community, it's where you get your future elected leaders, your future civic leaders. It's not coming from anywhere else. So that's kind of big picture messaging, but on a small level, depends on the context, which way we're going to go with it.
Thank you. State Attorney Nelson, I'd like to hear from you as well. You know, like I said, this word of criminal justice reform has become divisive in some ways. And how do you kind of get past those concerns about that term and show the value in a deflection program?
I keep doing that. I have said for now many, many years, I think it takes a lot of hubris to suggest that wherever we work, in whatever system we work, that we shouldn't be constantly in a state of auditing how we do things and seeking ways to improve things, especially for those of us who work in government and are also charged with being sound stewards of taxpayer dollars. And so it's unfortunate that reform, the idea of improving a system, has definitely become divisive. Certainly, we see that rhetoric everywhere, but in terms of how we convey to the public that this is a worthwhile endeavor, now we have 6 years of data to actually prove our point. So it's not just me or any other single person making the case that this is a wise thing to do. To Jack's point, to invest in our future. But now we can actually point to data to say, hey, this it's good for public safety, it's good for youth, it's good for our law enforcement, and it's good for our tax dollars. So our State Department of Juvenile Justice has reported that we have, since 2018, through the usage of civil citation as opposed to arrest, which obviously has costs associated with booking and court, et cetera, that we've saved almost $13 million in tax dollars. Our recidivism rate, which is also tracked not by us, so by an independent, which is wouldn't be incentivized to, I guess, manipulate data, shows that at a 16, almost 1,700 successful completions, 51 kids have been rearrested and convicted. So that's a recidivism rate of 3%. I just think when you have data like that, you can't argue with the efficacy of this. We also found, and I think this mattered to the public when you're talking about public safety, in one county that we have, when a law enforcement officer arrests a juvenile, it takes that law enforcement officer out of circulation, that is out of service, for up to 4 hours in order to get the youth downtown in Jacksonville, where we have our facility, book them, and then get back to the county where he or she is patrolling. Civil citation is obviously a much more efficient way to deal with an appropriate offense and allows that police officer to remain in circulation to respond to other calls. And the last thing I'll say in terms of messaging the effectiveness of this program, I say this a lot, but I've heard a couple of the other panelists talk about swiftness. I have 3 kids, and when they get in trouble, I don't say, come see me in 3 months with a lawyer and we'll talk about what your punishment is going to be, right? In order for it to be effective and in order for them hopefully to learn from it, it has to be swift. And the benefit of deflection is that it is swift. It's right there on the ground at the moment, being immediately referred to case management, a family being contacted, and the youth very in short order having one to be responsible and accountable to what he or she did, but also being sanctioned swiftly so that hopefully they don't return.
I love that you dived into the data in there, because I think that is a key part for all this, the buy-in and continuing the programs. And so Ms. Monroe, if you could talk, I know you do a lot with data as well in your position. Could you talk about the importance of data collection and evaluation in starting and maintaining these programs?
Yes, so I don't know that I can add much more to what Ms. Nelson stated, right? The data is key, right? It's what is going to drive how you get into sustainability of your programs. And so one of the things that we know we've been following, as I mentioned before, LA County in 2019, when they made the shift to divert 80% of their youth, to get to diverting 80% of their youth pre-arrest. And so since they've started their first cohort, they have diverted over 1,300 young people, and the recidivism rates are looking good. And I think the other piece that we often forget is, like, they've been able to capture connection for young people. And so the young people are reporting that they feel more connected to school, they feel more connected to community, and that piece, because we know that when young people feel connected, that they are they're more likely to really stay on the pathways that we want them to be on. And so being able to capture not only recidivism data, but connectivity data is so central and key. And it also, I think, takes us from this place where, when we talk about, in Mr. Charlier talked about, right, deflection, and you're centering community-based organizations that are doing that work. And often they're not capturing kind of the quantitative data. But if you sit with folks, you'll hear the qualitative piece, the narrative, the stories. And so LA County being able to, like, measure connectivity is starting in a quantitative way to capture a lot of that qualitative data, which is also just as important. And they're also able to look at, like, what does it do, because they're running it through a restorative justice model. So when a young person comes in and they get diverted, a restorative justice piece is essential to that, right? So how do you kind of repair the harm with the victim, and being able to understand, like, does a young person understand what's happened? Are they feeling that they're able to be accountable, but does the victim feel heard? Which I think to an earlier point about swiftness is that often when we are taking young people through this court process, which a couple of things can happen, right? Sometimes they just go to court and nothing kind of happens. They're just sitting. And that can be okay because many young people might grow out of the misbehavior. But for some young people that need some type of intervention, it's actually not okay because this missed opportunity to get the wraparound services that would be helpful. So, we want to be able to show that all of these things work, because when we can show that they work and you can capture the savings, which is a huge part, right? Taxpayers, young people, folks want to know that you can capture the savings and that the young person is better. And that's what the data hopefully is leading us to. And so that's what we're looking at, even as we start to build out this, like what is the data that we need to capture? And so I think a lot of the other panelists said, like, I'm learning so much. I'm taking notes as I sit here on this panel, and I'm thinking through like, okay, I'm hearing from Melissa, like, and Cara, what kind of data, and Jack, that we should be thinking about capturing as we begin to work with sites and identify places that we want to learn from and help them identify like what's going to be meaningful as you kind of advocate to move in this direction. And then the other piece I'd say, we talked about like, how do you get buy-in? Well, the data piece is really important, not just in terms of like ensuring that you're making good use of taxpayer dollars, or you're making good use of, as a foundation employee, right? We have to be good stewards of our endowment, but also how do you get the buy-in from law enforcement? Because if they see that this works, right, that it's being addressed, that's, I think, the biggest pushback that we often hear is that we're seeing the same kids over and over and over again. And but if you give them an opportunity to divert young people to the right places, you don't see them over and over again, certainly not in the same context. So you might see them, but you're seeing them in a very different context, not in the context, ideally, hopefully, of kind of getting in trouble, but in the context of moving forward in positive ways. And so the data helps tell all of that, and it helps tell the story. And it also is important because we have to track the equity of this work. What we don't want is to do this work and be inequitable. We want to ensure that all kids are getting these opportunities. And so you've got to track that through data too. You've got to be really specific about it. And we've got to call it out and not think that we can kind of do a broad brush over it, but we have to say, like, which young people do we know? We want to make sure that we're capturing them, that they're getting I'll use the word here. I'm adjusting myself because I'm used to saying diverting, but which young people are we deflecting into community-based programs? Are they all getting equal opportunities for deflection? And so we want to capture all of that through data. So I can't underscore enough. I think in KC itself is a data-driven organization, but I can't underscore enough about the importance of making sure we're capturing those things and how we build it in from the start, from the beginning of the program.
Thank you. And Ms. Monroe, you hit on that there's both quantitative and qualitative data, which I think is such a great point. And I would love to go over to Ms. Evans-Patterson. And I know you have talked a little bit about some of your quantitative data, but can you just talk about the importance of both the quantitative and qualitative data? And if you have any specific stories you want to share too, this would be a great time.
Yeah, we do collect both. As far as when sometimes young people complete the program, we do offer additional services, which is helpful. So we actually can keep in contact with them longer than the actual program. So we have different youth diversion programs. We have a program called Envision Academy with CMPD, where we offer an 8-week scholarship program to young people to expose them to everything Charlotte has to offer. So we definitely get to have hands-on with them after they've completed the program, if they haven't been in any trouble anytime after that as well too. We actually give them a stipend as well. And that's just kind of a way for us to make sure that they're not getting in any trouble during the summertime. But as far as the actual data goes, as far as we do track recidivism rate, like I mentioned before, and that's just to see if they've been arrested. We don't even look into disposition after they've come to court. So I know our recidivism rate would be a lot lower than that. And because I work in law enforcement agencies, I can actually break down the recidivism rate based on each type of program that we have. Like I said earlier, we have different types of programming for substance, for conflict, different academic programs, and we can break those down and track them just to see how the facilitators are actually doing as far as programming, not just the entire diversion program umbrella. Some of the other type of data collecting is, we discussed school to prison pipeline, and we started in 2013, but we also try to track data from before diversion even started on all of that. So with school to prison, juvenile arrest, before diversion started, we've reduced it by 27% compared to 2019. And if I compared it to 2021, because we're still at the tail end of COVID, it would be 47%. But I really don't like to track that because we're doing 2019 before COVID, that's kind of realistic. And we've reduced that since the program started by 27%. And as far as racial and ethnic disparities go, we're reducing that as well by another 27% comparing 2019. Because again, 2021, that data with COVID is just difficult to read. As far as the different types of data that we're collecting, of course, race, age, location, just the school they attend, the type of charge. So we're trying to track all different types of data in our data system. So whenever we're asked to report out, we can go in our data system and pull that at any date. We do a lot of monitoring our program from the different type of grants we have. We have a GCC, Governor's Crime Commission grant, and we also have JCPC, Juvenile Justice Crime Commission Council as well. The last thing I just kind of want to go over really quick is our goal pretty much is to provide services to youth, because we know that sometimes when they go into the court systems, they don't always receive services, but they have that juvenile arrest tacked onto their name. We want to avoid that. We also want to avoid that labeling effect with just the label of having a juvenile arrest, which could possibly affect any them getting jobs in the future. And just juvenile court costs, period. There's no cost for attorney fees or court counsel fees because there's no involvement in the court system with diversion at all. There are different types of diversion, where there's before court diversion and there's after court diversion. So I just want to explain that CMPD's diversion is before court involvement. So there's no interaction with chief court counselors, the judges, or anything like that with this program.
Thank you. We actually got several great questions, so I'm going to roll into the attendee questions to make sure that we get to them. If anybody else has questions, please feel free to drop them into the question and answer chat box. I'm going to kind of pick which ones to go to because we have somewhat answered some of these. But the first one I'd like to go to is for Ms. Evans-Patterson. What is the value of only serving first-time low-risk offenders to participate in the program? Should youth be given more than one opportunity for deflection? What happens with the youth that having contact with law enforcement after the first time with deflection program?
Like I mentioned before, we use the graduate response level. So normally, if it happens within the school system, the school can handle it. That's normally the first time. And then if they're coming to diversion and they get in trouble after diversion, then I'll normally contact the school resource officer. Did they ever do school diversion? If you don't want to do that arrest, and they've already done diversion, try school diversion. We also have other different programs. Like I said before, diversion is funded through different sources, but one of them is JCPC, Juvenile Justice Crime Commission Council, and they have other diversion programs that can be referred to. So I normally provide a list of programs that you can make direct referrals to. I do roll call trainings to all the school resource officers, all the different patrol divisions, and all the surrounding agencies. And I provide them with those different resource packages. You can refer to me. If you don't want to do that juvenile arrest, then you can refer again. I know I think past where Florida can do a second diversion or a second civil citation. We're not there yet. So I make sure that I provide those officers who don't want to do that arrest, if they don't feel it rose to that level, to provide them with a different route to take.
Could I chime in on it? You said that we could if we needed to. Is that okay?
I was just about to ask if any other panelists wanted to add in.
So
So there you go. Floor is yours.
Sounds good. Thank you. I'm going to bring up again the difference between deflection and diversion and why we have coined this term. In deflection, because we're early and upstream, and this goes right to the point, there are no chances that you get. You get as many deflections as you need because nothing has happened yet. So when you get into that space where an arrest could have happened, and instead we're going to do something else with you, that's a slice of diversion. I don't mean to get technical, called like the pre-arrest space. You've heard people say that, but to the left of that, if you won't, I don't mean politically, but to the left, if you think of it as a stream or a river, upstream of that, you can get deflection as often as you want. And that reflects, by the way, the research and the science that says number 1, 2, 3 chances has no basis in science. It has no scientific background. If we're getting to people and they are not doing something for which you have to arrest, that's deflection. Give them as many chances as are needed for them to access treatment services, housing, because that's how we get the bang for buck proposition. So this isn't pushing back on what I would have said. It is saying the word deflection, again, centers us in community, brings in a whole different way of thinking and says, wait a minute, what difference does it make if it's 1 time or 7? If we don't need to arrest you, public safety reasons, the law requires it. And there are times you need to be arrested. That's clear. But if we don't need to do that, what difference does it make if it's 3 or 5, if we can stop you from getting into a worse situation, a worse place, or finding yourself doing something worse for the community? So I want to just kind of push that out there because that's important to this question that gets asked. There is no criteria on deflection because nothing's happened. We're just getting too early and upstream. If there would have been an arrest, then we can talk about things like programmatic and number of times and stuff like that. By the way, none of that is based still on research and science, even at that point. But I wanted to get that deflection definition in there. Again, I think that was important to the question.
Any other panelists want to respond to that or have anything else in addition to add for that specific question?
So I think I would just double down on, I have to get used to the terminology deflection versus diversion, but I want to double down on this idea of not having we used to call it bites at the apple. We want to make sure the kid can get the whole apple and not feel like you can only get 1, 2, or 3 bites. If really, and also separate out, like there are certain things. I saw a question in the chat about like net widening. And so there's things that we want to make sure like we're not net widening. And so when we think about like status offenses, well, what we would just call kid crimes, they're crimes primarily because it's a young person who's done it. Those are not kind of the things that certainly we want to be. And I think at this point, most courts don't want to see those. And they might necessarily need to have a deflection or a diversion to a community-based program, but there may be some other things going on, so it could be beneficial for them to have some supports and services. And so there's really understanding when you think about what kind of cases are you going to bring in, what's going to get diverted or deflected, what are those things, kind of having efficacy to that model so that this speaks again to the data question, right? Having some efficacy. These are the kind of cases that are just going to get diverted and being able to move forward. And that helps in some ways to try to control for the net widening that could happen, right? Because we know certain things, it's not a thing that we need to have, maybe even an intervention. We just need to let kids go and grow. But other things, we do need to have some support. And how do we get the support, and how many opportunities should you have at that support? And I think to Jack's point, it really should be endless. Like there shouldn't be, now if you've escalated to the point that you need court involvement, that's a different conversation. But if you know these are kind of the charges that we're going to divert every single time, then it shouldn't be because you've done this charge 3 times. Now it should be, we need to figure out what is the intervention that's going to help you be successful. So you kind of stop doing this deflection or divertible kind of offense.
And Ms. Evans-Patterson, did you have something to add as well?
I was just going to say, like, when you're within law enforcement agencies, you have your processes and procedures that are in place. And like I said, with diversion, there are some that are arrestable offenses and there are some that are not. And we do allow the officer to have discretion. That's something that we just don't want to take away from the officer. They also have an open door to come to me, hey, do you think this is a good fit for diversion, or are there any other programs? So that's another thing, to have good open communication between whatever agency you're referring to, whatever community program that you're referring to. Sometimes if they're not stopping whatever type of behavior, sometimes the services escalate. So we have a prevention program for 6 to 11-year-olds, and then we have an older program for our older adults, and then we even started to create an adult diversion program for our 18 to 24-year-olds. So we believe everybody needs some form of services. It's just what type of service.
Thank you. And then I'd like to jump into that question that Ms. Monroe started to answer about the net widening. So this idea that some juveniles who may have just had their cases outright dismissed and not had any sort of programming or case management with it, being looped into these deflection programs instead, because it may seem that it's not as offensive, but it actually widens that net of who's now being involved. So State Attorney Nelson, could you just talk a little bit about that? The attendee did ask that you specifically help respond to it, just about how do we reconcile the high rates of cases being dismissed with the need for making sure we're not widening the net by bringing more kids in the criminal justice system that might otherwise not have had their case prosecuted at all?
So at least our program, the way it works is a youth and or their parents can actually reject a citation. They can go to court where they could fight the charge. So if it's a charge that would be otherwise they believe subject to dismissal, they could certainly travel that avenue. I too am getting used to the term deflection, but I like it in that it's pre-arrest. But I don't see that this is widening the net when it's pre-arrest. It's certainly not widening the net of kids who are involved in the justice system while they've been involved with law enforcement. They're then immediately deflected to nonprofit service providers, case managers that are not in the justice system. Their next connection to law enforcement will be at the end of their sanction, when they actually recognize the officer who wrote the citation. So I actually view this as a way to I don't think it's expanding the net. I think it's actually narrowing the chute of the kids who are ending up in the justice system.
Thank you. And we only have 1 minute left. I know there was some more technical questions in there. I'm going to put up a slide with everybody's contact information. So if you do have additional questions, the panelists have agreed for you to reach out to them directly with some of those questions in order to help promote these programs across the nation. But thank you everybody for your time today. I hope you learned about the benefits and research behind juvenile deflection programs and how you might be able to get it started in your own community. And have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.